We're going to use our time machine tonight. In this episode, we will explore more than 3,000 years of the most ancient and certainly the longest antique civilization, Egypt. We'll talk history, culture, religion, architecture, wars, burial ceremonies, and more. So it is now time for you to relax and enjoy. Please adopt a comfortable position to prepare yourself for sleep. And once you're there, take a deep inhale and exhale slowly. Breathe in and exhale. Allow yourself to melt into your bed, which will soon become your time machine. Relax your mind and allow the time machine to do all of the work, because there's a lot to discover about the history of Egypt. Our journey begins several thousand years BC in the northeast of Africa. You know that Egypt is strongly associated with the river Nile, which is one of the longest in the world, together with the Amazon. And the Nile has two main tributaries: the Blue Nile, which has its source in Ethiopia, and the White Nile, which is longer and rises in the Great Lakes region in Central Africa. They meet in Sudan, near the city of Khartoum, and then the Nile flows in the desert towards the north and the Mediterranean Sea, where it ends in a large delta. The course of the Nile has not changed much in thousands of years. But when our story begins, during the Neolithic age, the desert around looked quite different. The Sahara was less dry than it is today. In fact, it was covered in savanna and could sustain prehistoric populations of hunters, small nomadic groups of humans that progressively settled in the Nile Valley. As early as in the 12th millennium BC, remains like rock carvings indicate that people lived close to the Nile and grinded grains to prepare their food. Very slowly, over several centuries, these populations changed lifestyle and adopted agriculture. They cleared the banks of the Nile from their forests to start cultivating, and we have evidence that by the 6th millennium BC, there were already rather large settlements along the Nile Valley, with several hundred people each. The concentration of population in the valley may have been accelerated by climate change about 10,000 years ago. North Africa started to dry, and this desiccation made the Sahara Desert appear over a period of several thousand years, replacing the savanna. These early settlers in the Nile Valley quickly learned to live depending on the river. Every year, the Nile rose and flooded the banks, leaving a layer of silt on the land that made it more fertile. This yearly cycle of the Nile's flood became for several thousand years the single most important event in the Egyptian calendar, because life in the entire valley depended on it. Several cultures flourished in what would become Egypt, producing pottery, herding cattle, weaving their first textiles with linen, developing an architecture because they were now sedentary. We have traces showing the use of mortar more than 6,000 years ago, and developing forms also of decorative arts on the artifacts they produced. Metals were progressively introduced and replaced stone to make tools or weapons. These cultures also practiced trade with regions south of Egypt, like Nubia, from where they bought copper and gold. Various settlements came to be regrouped under the same authority, and two kingdoms emerged in the 4th millennium BC. One in the north, corresponding to the delta of the Nile. This region is called Lower Egypt, and one in the south, along the valley, which is Upper Egypt. The dividing line between the two kingdoms was about where Cairo, the actual capital of Egypt, is built today. By the end of the 4th millennium, around 3150 BC, a king from the south, from Upper Egypt, probably called Narmer, defeated Lower Egypt and unified the two kingdoms. The history of ancient Egypt was ready to begin. Narmer ruled on an Egypt which had no pyramids and no big stone monuments yet, not even a conscience to be an exceptional civilization. And Egypt by then had not yet fully developed the art and writing in hieroglyphs that remain so famous today. And yet, the entire basis for the Egyptian civilization, its culture, its religion, and even its aesthetics were already there, and they remained incredibly stable, very little changed along the next 3,000 years. Narmer was the first pharaoh of the first dynasty, and 31 dynasties followed in the history of Egypt. Now this organization with dynasties was not how ancient Egyptians saw their history. It was created later by a historian called Manetho during the last period of Egyptian independence. Egyptians counted the years from the beginning of each reign. To them, even though the title of pharaoh could pass from one family to another, the pharaoh was close to a god. His relation to the gods was what maintained balance on earth, guaranteed the annual flooding of the Nile, and kept the world away from chaos. Pharaohs from the first dynasty adopted a crown that put together the crowns of Upper Egypt, representing a lotus flower, and the crown of Lower Egypt, representing a papyrus reed. two kingdoms were probably already culturally unified before they became one single entity. They had similar languages, cultures, and beliefs. For 500 years, this period called pre-dynastic saw the refinement of writing into a complex system of hieroglyphs and the development of architecture, especially for tombs. A particular type of tombs for wealthy people appeared, called the mastaba. It is a rectangular structure made of bricks, and the tomb itself was underground. The mastaba was built above to mark the location of the tomb. By the 27th century BC, Egypt was ready to begin a golden age, which lasted another 500 years and is called the Old Kingdom, or sometimes the Age of Pyramids. The construction of such impressive monuments as the pyramids was possible only because Egypt adopted an administration and an unified government like no other in the world by then. The territory of Egypt was divided into districts called nomes. There were more than 40 of these nomes, in which a nomarch, a civil servant, was responsible for collecting taxes and representing authority. Temples and religious beliefs were at the center of Egyptian society, and its organization was very strict. The majority of Egyptians were peasants, and they could not own the land or even own the product of their work. Everything belonged either to the state or a noble family or a temple. Even craftsmen and artists were not independent. They worked in shops built around the temples and were paid directly by the state. In a sense, if we want to qualify the Egyptian society and economy that appeared more than 5,000 years ago with modern political concepts, it would be a mix of theocracy, oligarchy, with elements that look like state communism. For most of the population, private ownership was limited to personal belongings like clothes, furniture, or small objects, sometimes a house, but the means of production, like land or workshops, were never the property of individuals unless they were from the nobility. For several thousand years, there was no currency at all. Trade was based on barter, and prices expressed in grains or precious metals. Prices were never free. They were fixed by the state or temples. And during periods of stability, it was nearly impossible for someone to change social class. But it seems this system was widely accepted. Legally, men and women were considered equals in the eye of the law, which was not very common during the antiquity. In ancient Mesopotamia, or later in Greece and Rome, women were minors, legally speaking. However, the society was still very patriarchal. Women could have religious roles, or in very particular cases even rule the country, but overall, men were almost always in charge. Above the peasants and below the nobility, in the social pyramid, there was a class of civil servants and scribes, who were educated men, ensuring that the administration worked and keeping track of production, trade, or supplies. There was also an upper class of engineers, architects, doctors, and priests who had received higher education and could sometimes be elevated to the highest ranks of the society for their distinguished service. The belief system that kept all this social order together with remarkable stability over several thousand years was of a religious nature. The power of the pharaoh was of a divine nature, and the Egyptians had an extensive pantheon with hundreds of gods and goddesses. Some of them were local, others were known all over the kingdom. Along Egyptian history, some gods rose to fame and gained followers, while others were forgotten. Some of them stayed worshipped all along, like Ra and later Amun-Ra, the sun god, Thoth, the god of knowledge and wisdom with an ibis head, Osiris, Isis, Maat, Nephthys, Sobek, the crocodile god, Anubis, Horus, Set, and many others. The myth evolved during the long history of Egypt, but one that always stayed was the belief in the judgment of the dead. After death, ancient Egyptians believed that the soul of the deceased passed in front of a divine assembly of gods. When people died, they began the journey in the afterlife that took them to the hall of Maat, the hall of justice. The deceased was presented to a balance that would weigh their heart against the feather of Maat. If their heart balanced with the feather, they were presented to Osiris and admitted into paradise. Otherwise, their heart would be devoured by the goddess Amit, standing next to the balance. Egyptians believed that every human being was made of physical and spiritual elements, what we would call a soul today. After death, invisible spiritual elements were freed from their physical envelope and could move freely. However, they still needed the remains or a physical substitute like a statue to be preserved so that the soul didn't get lost. Hence the belief that remains have to be preserved through mummification and buried with artifacts or treasure for wealthier people that can accompany them in the afterlife. With the Old Kingdom began the tradition to keep organs separately from the mummified body in special vases. And the art of mummification kept being improved, perfectioned for centuries. And 1,000 years later, during the New Kingdom, we will talk about it later, every organ was carefully removed from the body. The rest was desiccated in a mix of salts and then wrapped up in strips and put in a sarcophagus that could receive extraordinary decoration. But the Old Kingdom is most famous for the gigantic pyramids that pharaohs built to shelter their remains. Pyramids are an evolution from the mastaba from earlier periods. One of the most famous pharaohs from the Old Kingdom is Djoser from the 3rd dynasty who ordered the construction of the first pyramid in a necropolis called Saqqara, near Cairo. Then with the 4th dynasty came the golden age of pyramids. On the site of Giza, the 2 highest ones were commissioned by Khufu, also known under his Greek name Cheops, and his son Khephren. These pyramids required thousands of workers and the creation of a city on the site. They are a testimony to the level of sophistication the Old Kingdom had achieved, not only in architecture and transport, because the stones came from afar, but also in administration, because the construction required pulling together the resources of an entire country. It is believed today that they were built by peasants, drawn from all across Egypt, while the annual flood covered the fields so that they could not work at home. But they also required the contribution from numerous priests, mathematicians, and stonecutters. After these huge pyramids were built, kings and nobles kept commissioning more of them, but their sizes diminished. Maybe because they realized that the effort required was not sustainable. The Old Kingdom was also a period of trade between Egypt and other regions of the world. There was Nubia in the south, which corresponds to the south of modern Egypt and the north of Sudan today. From Nubia came gold and other metals. In the Horn of Africa, precious woods like ebony or incense could be found. And they also traded with Syria and Lebanon, from where cedar wood was imported. Against these goods, Egypt could sell grains, papyrus that was used to make paper, linen textiles, and other manufactured goods. The golden age for Egypt, that was the Old Kingdom, came to an end after the death of Pharaoh Pepi II. This pharaoh had an incredibly long reign, more than 80 years. This was very uncommon in a country where life expectancy was around 35 to 40 years, and about a third of children died before adulthood. Egyptian medicine was famous in the entire Middle East,